A street urchin shouted at the millionaire, "Don't eat it. Your wife put poison in it." On the way home to meet face to face with his wife, the millionaire was shocked to see what she was doing. Richard Wilson, one of the wealthiest men in New York, was a man who had molded the world to his will, like a sculptor chiseling life to fit his desires. He had wealth that allowed him to forget ordinary concerns, estates sprawling across the East Coast, and the ears of decision-makers in every industry he touched. But despite his financial empire, it was his belief in his close circle that he held as his greatest treasure. And among all, his wife, Margaret, was his prized confidant, the only one he thought he could trust unconditionally. Margaret had been his star, his anchor. She accompanied him to charity galas and black tie events, where she sparkled with grace and poise, radiating the quiet charm he adored. Margaret was always at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a picture-perfect companion who completed his public image. In private, she had been his sanctuary. Her laughter, her insight, and her warmth gave him a sense of purpose beyond contracts and bank statements. Richard often thought of her as his greatest fortune, an unbreakable bond. But lately, Richard felt an unsettling change in her. She'd become distracted, often lost in thought even in his presence. She began spending long hours outside their home, and while she said it was charity work, there was a detachment in her voice he couldn't ignore. Once, he had noticed her slipping her phone into her purse the moment he walked into the room. In years past, they had shared everything without restraint, but now there was a subtle distance. And as much as he wanted to deny it, it gnawed at him. One evening, after a grueling day managing deals in his office high above Manhattan, he found himself pacing the halls of his mansion, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. The lavish decor of his home, a symbol of his success, suddenly felt hollow. Restless, he decided to leave for a walk, thinking a breath of fresh air in the familiar streets of his youth might help clear his mind. He made his way downtown to the old neighborhood where he had started as a young man with little more than ambition and tenacity. Walking the narrow streets felt surreal. The modest shops and diners around him were a world away from his current life, yet they reminded him of a time when everything seemed possible. He passed an old cafe, the very same one where he had scrimped to afford coffee during late nights planning his first ventures. He couldn't help but smile at the memory of his younger self, full of energy and confidence, but far less experienced than he had once believed. As he stood there, lost in thought, a small voice cut through his reverie. "Mister, spare some change?" Richard looked down to see a young boy, no older than 10, with an intense look in his eyes, a look of guarded hope and vulnerability. The boy's clothes were worn, his hair messy, but he had an unusual intensity about him. "What's your name, kid?" Richard asked, his curiosity piqued. He rarely had the chance to talk to anyone who wasn't a polished executive or a well-dressed socialite. The boy glanced up, his eyes widening slightly. "My name's Tommy," he said quickly, looking at Richard as though he recognized him. "You look like you're pretty rich," he added, sizing him up in one sweeping glance. "How'd you get that way?" Richard laughed lightly, taken aback. "A lot of hard work," he replied, though he could see Tommy didn't seem impressed by his answer. "Well, mister," the boy continued, leaning in and dropping his voice to a whisper, "I know something. I know a secret. You give me $1, and I'll tell you something no one else knows." Amused by the boy's confidence, Richard dug a bill from his pocket and handed it over. He had half a mind to walk away once the boy finished his tale, but he couldn't resist hearing what this kid had to say. Tommy took the money, carefully folding it before tucking it into his pocket. His expression turned serious. "It's about your wife," he said quietly, his words landing like stones in Richard's mind. "I saw her with some man, mister. They've been meeting in secret right over there." He nodded toward a row of old townhouses nearby. The amusement vanished from Richard's face. He studied Tommy, the boy's words echoing in his mind. Was this child spinning a tale for a few more dollars, or did he know something? The street around them felt as though it had fallen away, leaving only the boy's words lingering. "What did you see?" Richard asked, doing his best to keep his voice steady. His heart, however, had begun to beat harder, and a knot was forming in his stomach. Tommy swallowed and nodded to an old building across the street. "Over there. She goes in with that man," he said, a hint of a child's innocent seriousness still in his tone. "I don't know what they're talking about, but they're always looking around, like they're hiding something." Richard tried to keep his face expressionless, but his mind was racing. This boy's story, the subtle shifts in Margaret's behavior, the lingering doubts that had haunted him, all of it began to twist together into an ugly thread of suspicion. "Thank you," he said finally, handing Tommy another $1 and watching him run off before he crossed the street. Every step felt heavier, as though he was walking into something irreversible. He reached the building and looked up, scanning the windows, half expecting Margaret to emerge. Part of him wanted to leave, to go back to his mansion and convince himself this was all a fabrication. But then he saw her. Through a window on the second floor, there she was, standing by the window, laughing softly with a tall, sharply dressed man. The two were close, speaking in hushed tones, and even from this distance, Richard could sense their intimacy. It wasn't the laughter he recognized from his years with Margaret. It was something softer, something secretive. He felt as though the air had been punched from his lungs, and he clenched his fists, struggling to make sense of what he was witnessing. Unable to look any longer, he stepped back into the shadow of the building, feeling as though he was seeing his life from the outside. His love, his trust, all his devotion to her suddenly felt hollow, as if it had all been poured into a well with no bottom. Back in his car, he sat in silence, numb and unsure of what to do. Memories of their years together flooded his mind. Their first dance, her laughter as they celebrated his first million, the quiet nights spent talking about their dreams. Each memory was a painful reminder of what he was losing. He gripped the steering wheel, willing himself to think clearly, but the realization was a knife twisting deeper with each passing second. By the time he arrived home, the mansion felt colder, its grand halls empty and lifeless. He climbed the stairs, passing their shared photos on the walls, a stark contrast to the betrayal he now knew lay beneath them. His hand paused on the door to her room, and he pushed it open, only to find her sitting by her vanity, a faint smile as she applied her lipstick. "Richard," she said, glancing at him in the mirror, "you're home early." He didn't answer, only stared, wondering how she could wear the face of the woman he had loved without a trace of guilt. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. Now was not the time. He needed more answers, more proof, but in that moment, he felt as though everything he believed in had shattered. That night, as he lay alone in bed, Richard felt himself plunge into a void of doubt and rage. He thought of Tommy's warning, the stolen glances, and the coldness that had grown between them. Nothing he did, no amount of wealth or power, could take away the darkness creeping over his life. From now on, he decided he would play her game. He would watch every move she made, study every word she said, until he uncovered the full extent of her betrayal. And when the time came, he would be ready. For days, Richard lived as if on a precipice, teetering between two lives. Outwardly, he was the same commanding businessman, overseeing mergers and crafting new ventures. But within, he was consumed by thoughts of Margaret's betrayal. She had been his partner, his love, the one he thought he could rely on beyond all the uncertainties of wealth and power. Now, she was a stranger, a specter lurking in the very home they had built together. And the worst part was, he could not confront her. Not yet. As he observed her carefully, he began noticing even the smallest signs of deceit. She had become more secretive, her phone rarely leaving her side, and her eyes occasionally darting toward him, as if gauging his awareness. Each movement, each word they exchanged, felt like a thinly veiled act, a dance of pretense masking the lies between them. He played along, feigning ignorance, but inside, Every glance and every feigned smile felt like a knife turning slowly in his chest. One evening, after she had left for another supposed charity meeting, Richard decided he could no longer wait. He had to know what was going on, who she was meeting, and what they were planning. So he reached out to a private investigator he had used years ago, a man named Harvey Hall. Harvey was discreet, resourceful, and ruthlessly efficient, the kind of man who knew how to blend into shadows. "Harvey," Richard said quietly when the man picked up the phone, "I need you to find out everything about my wife's movements. Every meeting, every person. I need it discreet." "Understood," Harvey replied, his tone respectful and without question. He knew that Richard was not a man who would make such a request lightly. As Richard hung up, he felt a strange combination of dread and relief. At last, he was taking action, no longer a passive observer in his own life. But the thought of what Harvey might uncover gnawed at him, making sleep elusive that night. He lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, haunted by images of Margaret with her mysterious lover, laughing at his expense, conspiring to take from him not only his wealth but his dignity. The next morning, he was at his office, reviewing a particularly complicated merger deal, when his phone vibrated with a text from Harvey. "We need to meet. Tonight, usual place." Richard's heart beat faster as he read the message. Whatever Harvey had found was urgent enough to warrant a face-to-face conversation. He wrapped up his meeting early, barely listening to his executives as they discussed projections and stock prices. His mind was elsewhere, focused solely on what awaited him that evening. When night fell, he left the mansion, telling Margaret he had an unexpected business engagement. She didn't question him, only smiled in that graceful, practiced way that now felt sinister. He wondered how he had ever missed the coldness hidden beneath her charm. He met Harvey at an upscale, discreet bar they had used for private meetings in the past. Harvey was already seated, his lean frame hunched over a whiskey. He nodded as Richard approached, gesturing for him to sit. "What did you find?" Richard asked, keeping his voice low. Harvey didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long sip of his drink before sliding a slim folder across the table. Richard opened it, his eyes scanning the photographs inside. There she was, his Margaret, entering a luxury apartment building on the Upper East Side. The timestamp showed it was the same night she had claimed to be at a gala. A second photograph showed her with a man, laughing and leaning in close. Richard's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages, each photograph feeling like another betrayal, another lie. His jaw clenched, and his hands gripped the folder, fighting the urge to tear it apart. "There's more," Harvey said, his tone grim. He placed a small recorder on the table and pressed play. As the recording played, Richard's suspicions turned to fury. The man's voice was smooth, confident, speaking of their plans in hushed but unmistakable tones. "Once the assets are transferred to your name," the man was saying, "he'll have no idea. We can move to Europe and start over." Margaret's voice, laughing softly, cut through the static. "Poor Richard," she said, the words dripping with sarcasm. "He's so busy with his companies that he doesn't see what's happening right under his nose." Harvey paused the recording, studying Richard's reaction. But Richard's face was stone, a mask of controlled rage. "How far are they in these plans?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They've started making preparations," Harvey replied. "She's filed paperwork to set up private accounts, separate from your assets. And she's already made plans to meet with your lawyer under the guise of revising your will." Richard closed the folder, his jaw tight as he forced himself to breathe slowly. This was not the end, he told himself. He had the means, the resources, and the resolve to turn this around. "Thank you, Harvey," he said, slipping an envelope of cash across the table. "You'll continue to track their movements?" "Absolutely," Harvey replied, nodding with understanding. "Whatever you need, Richard. Just say the word." Richard left the bar feeling an odd sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do, and he would be methodical, calculating, just as he had been with every business deal that had built his empire. But now he was fighting not only for his wealth, but for his pride, his dignity. He could not let her get away with this. She would learn, as so many others had, that Richard Wilson was not a man to be deceived. Over the following weeks, Richard played his role to perfection. He laughed at Margaret's jokes, held her hand at public events, and treated her as though she were still his beloved wife. But behind the scenes, he was dismantling her plan piece by piece, setting traps that she would never see coming. He began by meeting with his own lawyer, a trusted friend who had been with him since his earliest days in business. Together, they crafted a counter-strategy. Richard ensured that his assets were locked down, moving funds into secure accounts that Margaret could not touch. He placed his most valuable holdings into a trust, controlled by him alone, ensuring that even in the worst-case scenario, his empire would remain intact. He also discreetly transferred ownership of their properties, consolidating them under his name alone. And through Harvey, he kept a close watch on Margaret, noting each meeting, each whispered phone call, each new lie she wove into her scheme. But even as he worked to protect himself, a darker plan was forming in his mind. He knew that simply catching her was not enough. He wanted her to feel the same shock, the same betrayal that he had felt. He wanted her to know that she had been outsmarted by the very man she had thought so easy to deceive. One evening, as they were preparing to attend a fundraiser together, Richard decided to put his plan into motion. He watched her dress, her movements graceful and unhurried, as though she were entirely at ease. She looked stunning, draped in a crimson gown that accentuated her beauty. She caught his gaze in the mirror and smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. "Ready, darling?" she asked, her tone sweet and affectionate. "Of course," he replied, managing a smile that felt like a mask. "You look beautiful, Margaret." Her smile widened, and she came over, taking his arm as they descended the grand staircase. But as they entered the car and headed toward the event, Richard felt a simmering sense of satisfaction. Tonight, everything would change. At the fundraiser, he moved through the crowd with Margaret by his side, greeting acquaintances and discussing business as though nothing was amiss. But his eyes were on her, watching her every move. And when he noticed her slipping away to take a phone call, he signaled Harvey, who was posing as a photographer in the crowd, to follow her. As Harvey trailed Margaret to a secluded corridor, he recorded every word of her conversation. She was speaking in hushed tones, but her words were clear. "Yes, darling, it's all going according to plan," she was saying. "We'll be free soon enough. Just be patient." When she returned to Richard's side, her face was calm, her demeanor warm. But he felt only a cold sense of detachment as he held her hand, looking into her eyes, wondering how he had ever loved a woman so skilled in deception. That night, as they returned home, Richard made his final move. He had the evidence, the knowledge, and the connections to destroy her scheme, and he would do it without her ever suspecting. By the time she realized what had happened, it would be too late. For now, he waited, savoring the irony of the situation. Soon, Margaret would learn just what it meant to betray Richard Wilson. Over the next few weeks, Richard worked methodically, his every step meticulously calculated. He knew that Margaret was dangerously close to executing her plans, but he also knew she had no inkling of what awaited her. He could feel the final moments of their silent war drawing nearer, a tension building like a storm ready to break. On the surface, nothing had changed between them. They dined together, discussed their weekend plans, and attended public events with the same grace and poise they had always shown as a couple. But now Richard found a twisted satisfaction in each passing day, knowing that her plot was already crumbling beneath her. The more she smiled, the more he smiled back, knowing her world was about to fall apart. One afternoon, he received a message from Harvey. "She's meeting with the lawyer tomorrow. It's time." Richard replied with a single word, "Understood." The following day, Richard watched Margaret leave the house, her demeanor calm, her expression as placid as ever. He knew she was headed to their lawyer's office, where she planned to finalize the first of her transfers, moving significant assets under her control. But what she didn't know was that their lawyer was fully aware of her intentions and had been briefed by Richard to play along. At the office, Margaret was greeted with the utmost respect. She was shown into a private room where their lawyer, William Grayson, awaited her. He rose to shake her hand, his expression neutral. "Margaret, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I understand there are some documents you'd like me to review?" "Yes," she replied, her voice warm but businesslike. She handed him a folder filled with legal paperwork she had carefully prepared over the last several months. These were the documents that would sever her financial ties to Richard, transferring his assets into her name without his knowledge. Grayson scanned the papers, his expression betraying nothing as he reviewed her demands. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice calm. "These are significant changes." Margaret offered a soft laugh. "Quite sure. I just want to ensure that Richard's interests are well taken care of. You know how distracted he's been with his business ventures," she added, feigning concern. Grayson nodded, carefully placing the documents back into the folder. "I'll make the necessary adjustments, Margaret. We'll have everything in order within a few days." "Thank you, William," she replied, smiling with a touch of triumph. She stood to leave, her mission seemingly complete. But as she reached for the door, Grayson spoke again. "Oh, Margaret, one more thing. Richard has arranged a family dinner tomorrow evening. He asked me to let you know it's important." Margaret paused, masking her surprise. She had expected Richard to be occupied with work as usual. The thought of a family gathering felt suspicious, but she couldn't show her hesitation. "Of course," she replied with a gracious smile. "I'll be there." The next evening, Richard prepared the grand dining hall for their gathering. He arranged a small but intimate setting, inviting only a few close friends and trusted allies. The chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow across the room, and the table was set with their finest china, the air filled with the scent of carefully selected dishes. When Margaret arrived, she looked radiant, her face lit with a subtle anticipation. She greeted their guests with practiced charm, and for a moment, she seemed every bit the loving, devoted wife. But Richard knew the truth. He watched her, the faint satisfaction in her smile, the way she moved with a confidence that spoke of her secret plans. Tonight, he thought, would be the night she realized just how wrong she had been. As dinner was served, Richard led the conversation, keeping the atmosphere light and casual. Laughter echoed through the hall, and glasses clinked as toasts were made. Margaret seemed at ease, her guard down, convinced that her plans were falling into place. She even dared to steal a few discreet glances at Richard, as though savoring her victory. Finally, as the evening drew to a close, Richard stood, raising his glass for a final toast. "To my dear wife, Margaret," he said, his voice filled with warmth and admiration. "A woman of remarkable charm and resilience. She has been my partner through every success, every challenge. And I want to thank her for being here tonight, as we celebrate not only our life together, but also the strength of our bonds." Margaret beamed, unaware of the deeper meaning behind his words. The guests raised their glasses, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But then Richard's tone shifted. He lowered his glass, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "And now, Margaret," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "I'd like to show you something special, a gift, you might say, for all the years we've shared." A look of confusion crossed her face, but she maintained her composure, smiling politely as he gestured to an attendant, who stepped forward with a silver tray. On the tray was a stack of documents, carefully arranged for her to see. "These," Richard said, his voice cold and unyielding, "are the transfer agreements you filed, the ones you intended to use to secure my assets for yourself. And these," he added, lifting another set of papers, "are the legal annulments I've filed in response. Consider this your exit package." Margaret's face went pale. She stared at the documents, realization dawning on her as she processed the implications. You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh, I knew, Richard replied with a dark smile. I knew long before you even began plotting. You've been living in a fantasy, Margaret, one where you believed I'd never see through you. But you underestimated me, and tonight, I'm ending this charade. The room fell silent as the guests watched, stunned and horrified. Margaret's composure shattered. She glanced around, her eyes wide with panic as she realized that everyone knew that she had been exposed. She turned back to Richard, a plea in her eyes. Richard, please, we can fix this. We can start over. No, Margaret, he said, cutting her off. There's nothing left to fix. You wanted to play a game and now you've lost. Everything you wanted, everything you planned is gone. She looked down, tears filling her eyes as she took in the weight of her actions. The realization that her scheme had been a catastrophic failure. Her life of luxury, her status, the wealth she had tried to seize. All of it was slipping from her grasp. Richard motioned for security, his expression unyielding. Margaret, you have 24 hours to leave the estate. Take whatever you need, but know that you'll never be welcome here again. As the guards approached, Margaret looked around in desperation, searching for anyone who might show her sympathy. But there was none. The friends she had once charmed, the allies she had counted on, all stared at her with a mixture of shock and disdain. Please, Richard, she whispered one last time, her voice broken, but he turned away, his silence more cutting than any words could have been. Without another word, she was escorted from the dining hall, leaving Richard standing alone at the head of the table. The room was quiet, and his guests watched him with a mixture of awe and respect. He raised his glass once more, a final, silent toast to a victory won not in the boardroom, but in the quiet chambers of his own heart. That night, Richard walked through the empty halls of his estate, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent rooms. The portraits that once hung as symbols of his pride now seemed to gaze down on him with a newfound clarity. Margaret's presence was no longer a haunting shadow. Instead, the mansion felt restored, free of the deceit that had tainted its walls. For the first time in months, he felt a peace settle over him. His life, his fortune, and his legacy were secure, untainted by the betrayal he had so narrowly escaped. Standing by the window, he looked out over the darkened grounds, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle was over, and Richard Wilson, alone but unbroken, stood victorious, ready to face whatever lay ahead.